Let's go?
Let's go.
Okay. And you have the text, Pérola. I sent it to you as an email.
Yeah, I have the text.
Good. Okay.
Okay, let's go.
Check my email.
Yeah. Okay?
Okay.
Go live.
Já?
3 segundos. Pode contar aí.
1, 2, 3.
Ok.
Bom final de manhã a todos que estão nos assistindo. É uma verdadeira alegria estar nessa manhã reunida com os nossos colegas que estão aqui nessa cena virtual, mas estão nos acompanhando online. Eu queria, em primeiro lugar, dizer algumas palavras de agradecimento, não é? Tanto a Pérola Goldfeder como a professora Josiane Nunes, da Universidade Estadual de Minas Gerais, por terem também facilitado esse encontro, pelos contatos que fizeram com o professor Richard John. E essa sessão vai ser toda em inglês, o professor vai falar em inglês e depois a gente vai abrir 1 ou 2 rodadas de perguntas que serão traduzidas, tanto por mim como pela Pérola. Bom dia, Carlos, bom dia. E a gente realmente está fazendo essa iniciativa que é para aproximar colegas, estudiosos, pesquisadores sobre as comunicações no Brasil do século XIX, e também convidamos colegas que estudam a história dos Correios no Brasil. Agora eu vou falar em inglês, só para o professor poder nos acompanhar. Também aviso a todos que essa sessão está sendo gravada e que a gente vai depois inserir as legendas em português, para que todos possam acompanhar e o material circule por aí. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Richard John on behalf of our historical cartography lab. Thank you, Pérola, for inviting Professor John to this lecture. The books of Professor John has inspired our research on the formation of the communications network in Brazil. And this is a very important topic nowadays because his work suggests new approaches of the transformation of the public sphere after the internet and also the phenomenon of the social medias. So it's a very contemporary subject that we want to discuss also today. I also thanks to the colleagues that are following us now, and we want to announce also the launch of the book, the Atlas, the Historical and Economic Atlas of the 19th century, that was conceived and made by Pérola Goldfeder and the Professor Luis Fernando Saraiva. It will be our next encounter in February, probably. And today you will see some of the maps they have made to this atlas. So I give the word to my colleague Josiane Nunes for her introduction. Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for being with us.
Thank you.
Bom dia a todos. Vou falar primeiro em português, depois vou fazer um breve agradecimento. Queria agradecer a amiga Pérola pelo contato. A nossa universidade vai estar sempre de portas abertas. A querida colega Iris, confiar esse espaço também à Universidade do Estado de Minas Gerais, ao professor Richard. Vamos nos organizar em breve para disponibilizar, como a professora Iris disse, as legendas. Sejam todos muito bem-vindos. Temos colegas assistindo a live ao vivo, a professora Mariane Junqueira, carinhosamente, da USP, que está presente. Acredito que mais alguns vão aparecer também. Então, em nome da Universidade do Estado de Minas, eu agradeço a organização e a disponibilidade de fazermos esse evento em coletivo, em conjunto, fortalecendo a universidade pública, gratuita e de qualidade. Bom, Professor Richard, we are very happy and speaking for us. Thank you very much. Welcome in my university, our new university, do Estado de Minas Gerais. Okay, thank you so much.
Now I'm going to read some.
I'll leave you with Pérola.
Okay, yeah. I picked some information from your CV at Columbia University, so I will read in Portuguese, and I don't read in English. Okay. Professor Richard John é historiador, especialista em história das comunicações e da tecnologia. Ele leciona e orienta no programa de pós-graduação em comunicações da Universidade de Colômbia, sendo também membro do corpo docente do Departamento de História dessa mesma instituição. Suas principais publicações são Spreading the News, The American Postal System from Franklin to Morse, Network Nation, Inventing American Telecommunications. John também foi presidente da Business History Conference, entidade internacional de pesquisadores dedicados ao estudo de empresas e instituições. Suas experiências de magistério ainda incluem a École des Études de Sciences Sociales, em Paris, e diversas universidades chinesas em Beijing e Xiamen. A sua formação universitária se deu toda em Harvard, tendo sido aluno da socióloga norte-americana Theda Skopal, né, que nós conhecemos bastante aqui, bem conhecida do público brasileiro, uma das responsáveis pela retomada dos estudos sobre Estado e instituições naquele país. Outra presença marcante na vida e obra de nosso convidado é Alfred Chandler Jr., fundador do campo de estudos Business History nos Estados Unidos, também conhecido aqui entre nós. Foi ele quem orientou John em seu doutorado sobre sistemas postais norte-americanos, que foi concluído em 1989. Well, now I let the word with you, Professor John.
Well, thank you.
Be our guest, okay?
Well, thank you so much, Professors Kantor, Nunes, and Pérola. It is a great pleasure to be here in Brazil via the affordances of our digital media network. Let me then get on with my talk. It's the morning after Thanksgiving in the United States, a holiday that in ordinary non-COVID times is a celebratory event in which family and friends get together, eat large quantities of food, and express gratitude for our many blessings. It's also a time when countless Americans navigate difficult conversations about politics and religion, two of the most divisive topics in our public life. This year is different. Many government officials have issued travel advisories. More than a few celebrations have taken place over the internet. Since the first lockdowns in March, the popular meeting app Zoom has become a ubiquitous presence not only in colleges and universities, but in households. Well, what kind of conversations can we guess that Americans have had over their Thanksgiving meal or their Thanksgiving Zoom call? Well, in many households, someone is likely to try to turn the conversation away from the still unfolding U.S. 2020 presidential election in the conviction that any discussion of its outcome is likely to erupt into an argument that might prove difficult to contain. Political disagreement, of course, is nothing new in the United States. Americans have been arguing about Americans have been arguing about politics over Thanksgiving ever since Abraham Lincoln proclaimed Thanksgiving the national holiday in the Civil War. Yet 2020 has some unusually divisive, controversial elements that I would like to highlight in the next 30 minutes or so. Let me begin with three public policy domains that I'm hoping might be of interest to you in Brazil. I will then say something about the presidential candidates, Donald Trump, who's the incumbent, having been in office since 2016, Joe Biden, who was vice president under Barack Obama, who's widely assumed to have won the election, though the victory has yet to be formally certified. I'll say something about that later. After I talk about these policy domains, I will close with a few historical observations, after which I'll do my best to respond to any questions that you might have. First policy domain, international relations. The second is the international movement, is the movement over borders, trans-border movement of people and goods, with a focus on immigration and trade. And the third is personal insecurity, the sense that the future is not certain. International relations, the first. That's a major reason that U.S. national politics is followed so closely around the world. I have relatives in Australia, most of whom I've never met in person. Yet on the night of the U.S. presidential election, we exchanged dozens of text messages about the peculiarities of the U.S. Electoral College, which is the strange institution right at the center of the U.S. presidential election. We also discussed why it's entirely possible, as happened with Hillary Clinton in 2016, for a candidate to win the popular vote and lose the election. It did not happen this time. Biden won many more votes than Trump. We assume that Biden will take office in January. So, more on international relations. According to one recent survey, the United States has about 800 military facilities of one kind or another in more than 70 countries. Around 40 of these facilities are military bases with active military personnel. Until 2017, if my research is correct, the United States had a Marine Corps facility in Sao Paulo. Given the scale of the U.S. global military presence, which, like the U.S. military budget, is far bigger than that of all the other major world powers combined, given the size of the scale of the U.S. military presence, it's no wonder the U.S. presidential election is watched closely in Europe, Asia, Latin America, and even Australia, which is a long way away from the United States. It might, however, surprise you to learn that foreign policy issues played a very small and indeed almost non-existent role in the debates leading up to our presidential election. So the U.S. is important in the world. We didn't talk about international issues. This is not because the two candidates have similar views about foreign policy. Nothing could be further than the truth. They're very different views. Beginning with the 2016 presidential campaign, and continuing through his presidency, Trump has pointedly challenged the long-standing bipartisan liberal consensus in U.S. international relations that originated during the Second World War. Liberal consensus. The consensus was liberal because, or so its champions proclaimed, the United States was defending not only the U.S. national interest, something all nations do. We were defending not only the U.S. national interests, but we were also attacking communism, defending religious freedom, promoting human rights. Trump has been silent on all of these issues, a startling break with tradition. Yet, notwithstanding, or perhaps because, notwithstanding a certain amount of saber rattling in Syria, President Trump has not embroiled the United States in a single major new conflict during his administration. For his supporters, this is a major point in his favor, pulling back from international engagements. Biden, in contrast, is a dedicated proponent of the liberal consensus, and following his inauguration in 2021, he can be expected to do what he can to rebuild many international links that Trump has imperiled, from NATO, that is the North American Trade Organization, to the Paris Climate Change Accord. Trump's iconoclasm in international relations extends beyond his rhetorical attacks on liberal internationalism. For Trump has also been an outspoken champion of authoritarian or illiberal regimes. Putin in Russia, Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil. And he's championed these regimes to an extent that has unsettled and startled and disturbed many U.S. foreign policy insiders. And this is precisely the point. Trump has popularized the idea that U.S. foreign policy has been run for many years by an internationalist clique, which he sometimes calls the deep state, that has embroiled the United States in conflicts large and small with disastrous results at home and abroad. There have long been public intellectuals on the left and on the right sharply critical of U.S. foreign relations. Noam Chomsky on the far left, and the recently established Quincy Institute on the center right, QUINCY. That's a nonpartisan think tank challenging liberal internationalism. Yet, never before has a U.S. president taken so many positions markedly at variance with the post-Second World War liberal consensus. This is more than a little ironic. Trump claims to want to make America great again. That's his slogan, MAGA. And when he says that, he claims he often points to the achievements of the U.S. military in the Second World War. Yet, Trump's foreign policy challenges the consensus that the United States forged during that conflict. Isolationism, as Trump's hostility to internationalism is often called in the United States, isolationism, this has a long history in the United States. Though, as Brazilians well know, U.S. isolationism has rarely extended to Latin America. Latin America has historically been understood to be in the U.S. sphere of influence, going back to the 19th century. All right. The first U.S. president, George Washington, publicly opposed the negotiation of any permanent international agreements. George Washington's successor, Thomas Jefferson, famously warned in his first annual address against entangling alliances with any foreign power. Isolationism can be a challenging position to defend, which is one reason that Trump has been hesitant to bring it up in his public debates. Yet, isolationism is a solid base of political support, a base that until now no party leader has tapped. Trump broke the mold with uncertain consequences for U.S. foreign policy in the years to come. So that's one clear distinction between Trump and Biden foreign policy, not much discussed during the presidential debates, but could be quite important down the road. Second policy domain that divides the two presidential candidates is the consequences of the rapid movement across national borders of people and goods. Trump has consistently opposed immigration to the United States. This policy broke sharply with the last U.S. Republican president, George W. Bush, who, like many business leaders, favored immigration and supported a path to citizenship for the many immigrants who had not yet become legal residents. So Trump here is breaking with his Republican predecessor. Democrats tend to be more supportive of immigration, with exceptions. But in general, point I'm making here is Trump is breaking with his own party. Immigration is a very tricky issue in the United States because since 1868, the U.S. government has guaranteed citizenship to anyone who's born inside the border of the country. This policy, which was originally intended to protect the rights of African Americans, to prevent them in effect from being re-enslaved, helps to explain why the U.S. government has embarked on this, to foreigners it must seem very bizarre policy of separating parents and children at the Mexican border. The parents were not born in the United States. The children were born in the United States. So the children are citizens. The parents are not citizens. And that's very difficult to change. You cannot simply change that by passing a law. You'd have to change that by a constitutional amendment. One of the surprises in the recent election, at least to Democrats, is that the vast majority of Americans who pollsters contend to be of Hispanic ancestry. That's the term of art in the United States, Hispanic ancestry. This is a huge group that includes people from over 20 nations. A large majority of this group of people did not identify themselves as Hispanic. So the pollsters say they're in a group called Hispanics, but a lot of the people who are in that group say they're not Hispanics. And by the way, at present, 62% of the people in this category are from Brazil, 10% from Puerto Rico, 4% from Cuba, less than 1% from Brazil. Okay? But this is a big group. But they don't consider themselves Hispanic. This is a challenge for Democratic Party strategists who have counted on the Hispanic vote. In Florida, South Florida, a very high percentage of Cubans from Miami supported Trump. Also, Americans of Venezuelan ancestry supported Trump. Now, that seems strange to Democratic strategists, but it makes a certain amount of sense in retrospect. Florida has a popular Cuban-American senator, Marco Rubio, who was a presidential contender in 2016. So, and the Venezuelans are concerned about, of course, the regime back home. According to a recent poll, only 1/4 of the people who the pollsters regard as Hispanic put themselves in the category of Hispanic. The catchphrase people of color, which is often used by Democratic pollsters and an awful lot of college students at Columbia, where I teach, that's even more problematic. It's not at all clear there's a category, people of color, in the United States outside of the imagination of the pollsters and the Democratic Party strategists. In fact, there's evidence from census data that over time, Hispanics are increasingly identifying themselves as white, following a pattern common among many other immigrant groups to the United States: Irish, Italian, Jews, Greeks. We had over for dinner last night a classmate of my son's who is from Mexico, and we just asked her, what do you consider yourself? She said she always was white until she came to the United States, and then people told her she was Hispanic. She's very uncomfortable with that. Okay, so that's part of this dynamic. It was a big surprise to the Democrats. It helps explain why the Democrats lost Florida, which the Democrats thought they could win. Now, ethnic identity is a particularly challenging problem for Democrats because party leaders have taken it for granted that minority groups that are, these are groups grouped together, just called minorities, though there's an awful lot of them, blacks and Hispanics among them, will support the Democratic Party. In fact, Trump did better among African American men in 2020 than he did in 2016, even though he made any number of comments critical of African Americans. And he did much better among Hispanics than he did in 2016. That's the group that the pollsters are putting together, all right? This is true despite the fact that he's attacked blacks, he's attacked Hispanics, attacked Mexicans, and he's done little to appoint members of either group to positions of power and influence. I don't believe he's appointed a single African-American federal judge. All right? So that's the second area here. Misperceptions about the electorate. And because of the peculiar way the U.S. presidential election is conducted, which I'm happy to talk about in the discussion, a very small number of voters in a particular state, such as Cubans in Florida, can make an enormous difference in the election. Trade policy. Well, this is not easily made into a campaign slogan. Yet, Trump's opposition to Chinese imports, I guess the Chinese import would include the COVID virus, which he's called the Wuhan flu, outraging many, right? His opposition to Chinese imports fits with his reputation as a deal maker who, as a result of his business experience, can cut deals that more conventional politicians will not undertake. Democrats have long backed international bodies, such as the World Trade Organization, that Trump has criticized. Here's one instance of several that I could cite in which the two parties are changing places. The Republicans are rejecting the free trade-centric Washington consensus that U.S. government officials promoted following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. How this will all work out in a Biden administration, it's hard to say. Preliminary signs are that Biden is going to rebuild U.S. standing in the World Trade Organization, re-enter the Paris Climate Accords, policies, and the and rebuilding standing in the WTO will not sit well with many of his left-leaning supporters who, like Trump, regard China's trade policies as unfair. So the left is supportive of the Paris Accords, critical of the WTO. Biden is likely to get the United States more centrally involved with both, and in particular, to challenge the rise of China's leadership in the WTO. Personal insecurity. Or I've talked about international relations. I've talked about movement of people and goods. Personal insecurity. This is a final, I'm calling it a policy domain, but it's a very amorphous issue that figured prominently in the recent election. Democrats are often inclined to write off Trump supporters as bigoted racists who are terrified of the growing number of non-whites in the country. That Trump has such, and among this, Trump's most reliable supporters are Protestant evangelicals. It's not all Protestants, but it's a majority of Protestants. I'm a Protestant, I'm not an evangelical, but I'm in the minority. That Trump has garnered such support among Protestant evangelicals, which is about 25% of the electorate, and it does tend to vote as a bloc. This has startled many of my colleagues at Columbia, which is a mostly secular university in which few faculty members have ties with any evangelical voters. They've probably never met an evangelical voter, the vast majority of whom live far from New York City in the South and West. So my colleagues ask, how could God-fearing people support a thrice-married philanderer, an alleged rapist, a serial liar, a man who is obviously immoral? Much of the answer, according to journalists and social scientists, and here I'm surveying the press, can be found in the personal insecurity that many Trump voters feel not only about the changing ethnic composition of the U.S. population. Is there going to be a non-white majority, which is probably not going to happen, but that's often discussed. But they're also worried about their job prospects, their social standing, and so on. It's widely assumed by Trump's voters that whites are an embattled minority. Many assume they'll no longer be in the majority. And here, much depends upon how you count who is white. Poor Americans, I mentioned that before, immigrant groups are going to tend to shift their identities over time, and there is an enormous amount of intermarriage in the United States. Most recently, the Vice President-elect Harris is married to a white man. So there you have an interracial union at the highest levels of U.S. government. That's increasingly common. That was very uncommon 20 years ago. And until the 1960s, a white-black marriage was illegal in the state of Florida. So when Obama's parents got married, because he was a product of a biracial marriage, when his parents got married, it would have been illegal for them to get married in Virginia. But that's changing. All right. What about the poor? Poor voters used to be reliable Democrats. This is no longer the case. The wealthiest counties in the United States have Democratic congressmen, and several of them vote overwhelmingly Democrat. Wealthiest counties often vote Democrat, while several of the poorest counties are represented by Republicans. The French economist Thomas Piketty has argued in his most recent book, Capital and Ideology, that the U.S. Democratic Party, like formerly left parties in Europe, including Britain, has become dominated by a multicultural, elite-led coalition. The Brahmin left is what he calls it. Brahmin as Brahmins in India. The Brahmin left that has lost its historical connection with the working class voters who made up the base of the mid-20th century Democratic Party. That was the Democratic Party under Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, the Democratic Party at the time of the Great Depression and the Second World War. These voters today, many of them, not African Americans, but many of them, many poor working class voters, are Trump Republicans, which is an appropriate moniker since Trump has helped to bring them into the party. Strangers in Their Own Land is the title of a recent book by Arlie Russell Hochschild, Hochschchild, Strangers in the Land. That's what she calls these Americans, in a haunting ethnography of poor whites in coastal Louisiana. From the perspective of these Americans, who are overwhelmingly Trump Republicans, Hochschild published the book before the 2016 election, and she went back and interviewed these people after the election. They're overwhelmingly Republican, and they are of the view that other people, particularly immigrants, have cut in line, imperiling their future. So they see other groups as kind of taking their place, making it hard for them to advance. These Americans are horrified by the world that they see on television or they follow on social media, and they're determined to fight against it, even at the expense of their own economic future. For these people are living in very impoverished areas, often hazardous waste sites, that would be much more likely to be benefited by Democratic policies and by Republican policies concerning work and pollution control. Trump has masterfully tapped into the resentments of the many Americans who have not gone to college, which is over about half the population, or a little more, or who fear that if their children go to college, their children will come home on break to denounce them as sexist, homophobic, racists. Right? So there's a concern about a culture gap here that is mediated by education. This point cannot be underscored enough. Trump is not, and not only in his foreign policy views, a standard issue Republican. He's something different. We've never had a leader like Trump in the White House before. Like Bolsonaro, Modi, Hungary's Viktor Orban, he's tapping into a popular hunger for identity, recognition, and belonging that combines nationalism, religious fervor, and an inchoate, ill-formed, but palpable resentment toward the structural structural transformation that economists, and not only economists, have labeled globalization. Whatever Trump says or does, and he said many outrageous things and done many outrageous things in the last 4 years, he's gained the loyalty of millions of voters who regard him as a change agent who can demolish an international political economic order that they, and by no means irrationally, have come to regard as inimical to their well-being. The 2020 presidential election is one of the first in the past half century, if not the first, in which neither candidate ran against a foreign threat. U.S. politics, typically the parties are somehow held together or moderated because they posit that there's some outside enemy. It was the Soviet Union, then it was international Islam. In 2016, briefly, it was Russia. Instead, the threat in 2020 has been internalized. And as this threat has become internalized, the two parties have demonized each other, which is at bottom why it proves so difficult this year for millions of American families to talk about politics during our Thanksgiving Zoom calls. So if the enemy is internal rather than external, and some of your family members are on the other team, that makes it very difficult to talk about politics. Trump's refusal to admit he's lost the election, though as of this morning, he said that he will leave in January. This is an issue of some interest in the United States, though probably nowhere else. His refusal to admit that he's lost, like the increasingly desperate gambit he has undertaken to invalidate his results, he's maneuvered following the election to undermine the legitimacy of the vote count, which is very strange, never happened before, and has caused a lot of opposition, resentment. This refusal and this strategy of challenging the legitimacy of the election fits with his overall strategy. By portraying himself and his supporters as the only true Americans, he has demonized just over half the electorate. Remember, Trump did not get a majority of the votes. It's a very dangerous strategy for a nation like the United States, whose political stability is predicated on shared conventions and norms, maybe like all countries. But in the United States, there are a large number of shared conventions and norms that Trump is challenging. Not until the Electoral College meets, that'll take place on December 14th, will the election be decided. And bizarrely enough, there's a slight possibility that enough electors will refuse to abide by the majority. The election will be thrown into the House, where each state would have one vote, and that could conceivably lead to Trump's election. I don't think it's going to happen. The electors are not likely to break with the wishes of the party that's appointed them in the states in which they have been, in which they're serving, but that could happen. All right. And even the fact that we're thinking that that might happen is startling. Let me close with a couple of reflections to put the 2020 election in a wider frame, since I am, after all, a historian. That the Republican Party nominated Trump in 2016 was proof not of the party's prescience. After all, Trump would win. Well, the party picked a winner. But instead, the fact that the party picked Trump in 2016 was a demonstration of the extent to which party leaders had lost control of the nominating process. Had the Republican Party been stronger, they never would have nominated Trump, right? There's no question about that. Once he's in office, the dynamic has shifted. And by 2020, the Republican Party has become Trump's party, but it was not in 2016. Now, how did this happen? How did the parties get weakened? Since the 1970s, both Democrats and Republicans have increased their reliance on primaries to choose candidates. So what is a primary? A primary is a party-run kind of it's a vote that in some instances can take place almost a year before the presidential election. And it always occurs before the national party conventions in which parties choose their candidates. So the rationale for the primaries came from the 1960s, when Democrats were unhappy that the party was nominating centrist candidates. It was not nominating candidates who supported opposition to Vietnam War and were enthusiastically enough in support of the social reforms of the 1960s. So the party was deliberately weakened. The Republicans followed along. As a consequence, voters in primaries have a great deal of power. Voters in primaries the voters who show up, which is a small percentage of all the voters, they tend to be much more ideologically strident than the general electorate. So they tend to push the Republican Party to the right and the Democratic Party to the left. As recently as 1968, Hubert Humphrey got the Democratic Party nomination without having been on the ballot in a single primary. All right, that couldn't happen today, because the primaries are what's choosing the candidates. and the primaries are largely out of control of the parties. And that's an issue that's not going to go away. You could have a similar challenger on the Democratic side, emerging out of nowhere, who has views that are extremely unconventional, let's say. That could happen too. So far, it's only happened to the Republicans. The two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, now I'm putting on my historian's hat a little deeper. The two parties took form in the years before the American Civil War, that is to say, before 1860. The Democrats emerged in the 1830s under its standard bearer, Andrew Jackson. The Republicans in the 1850s, led by Abraham Lincoln. So these are two men that are on our currency, right? Lincoln's on the $5 bill, Jackson's on the $20 bill. Long time ago, they the founders of the two parties that we still have today. It is sort of remarkable, given all the changes in the United States, that we still have two parties, and the two parties are this old. For much of our history since the Civil War, these parties have been regional coalitions. The Democrats were a Southern party with a Northern wing until the 1960s. The Republicans Party was a Northern party with a Southern wing. Okay? Both parties fought for the West. And if you know, the children's book became a movie. It's called The Wizard of Oz. That's a parable about the regionalism of American politics. The West, the North, South. These shifting regional alignments are the stuff of American political history. Until quite recently, American history was very sharply regional. Arguably, it still is, but something has changed. Well, what has changed? Region is no longer the only or even the most important political divide. For parties today, divided not only by location, but also by ethnic and cultural affinities. And sometimes these have a religious cast, right? Culture and religion have always been important in American public life, yet they perhaps are as important or even more important today. Yet these cultural and religious affinities do not align in any obvious way with these mega regions, North, South, and West. Instead, they divide urban and rural conclaves inside cities, or in the state of Pennsylvania, which has an unusually complicated electoral history, into the East, the Middle, and the West. So there's lots of divides that are not regional. And sometimes you can chart these divides inside a single apartment building, how the voters will go. It was long a cliche in national politics that South Florida was part of the North and North Florida was part of the South. But today, that's not true anymore. Cuban voters in Miami demonstrated that. Now, it may well be, surprising as it might at this moment appear, that Republican leaders like Marco Rubio of Florida will build a working-class, Hispanic-friendly coalition that could challenge the Democrats in the Southwest while keeping Florida and Texas in the Republican column. It's also possible that either or both parties may split, with left-leaning Democrats, frustrated at Biden's centrism, forming a Democratic Socialist Party around lawmakers such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Trump loyalists banding together in a revanchist white supremacist party with Trump or his son at its head. We don't know what's going to happen, and I'm a historian, and I don't make predictions. But whatever happens, U.S. politics is becoming increasingly nationalized. In the absence of an external foe to supplant the Soviet Union, and for a time it was international terrorism, the jihad, in the absence of this foe, two enemies that at the moment have lost their ability to terrify, the Soviet Union, Islamic Jihad. Today, domestic politics is likely to remain preoccupied with internal enemies, not external enemies. Should such an external enemy emerge, the obvious candidate being China, should an external enemy emerge, a more stable two-party dynamic might be the result. Until it does, U.S. national politics is likely to remain bitterly contested. Now, what this portends for the world beyond the United States, no one really can say. But for Americans, it's likely to mean that when we get together in person, I hope next year for Thanksgiving, we may once again agree to disagree and not to talk about politics with our family and friends. That's what I got. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor John. Professor Aries, Professor Josiane, do you want to put some words? And I can put my comments. I will read my comments. Actually, I made some comments like brother on your. I didn't read your text before, so my comments will be in. I will try to complement in a communication abroad approach. I will read in Portuguese, but you can see attached in the private, both in the private chat and the public chat. My comments are attached in English, so you can follow, and other foreign colleagues can follow too. Ok? Eu agradeço a todos por essa, por essa possibilidade aí de estar discutindo, nos inteirando, né, mais sobre as questões mais profundas, né, americanas do momento. A gente encontra muitos pontos de conexão entre as angústias dos americanos nesse último Thanksgiving, né, que é um feriado da comilança, é um feriado da confraternização, do vinho, e talvez esse ano, pelo que o professor John colocou, um feriado um pouco tenso para as famílias, né, não só por estarem em Zoom, mas também pelas questões políticas que foram colocadas, né. Meu comentário um pouco vai talvez destoar um pouco da fala do professor Richard, no sentido de que eu vou abordar um pouco a questão das comunicações, né, e deixa eu explicar um pouco para o público, né, como que, né, com base em que eu resolvi fazer esses comentários. O professor Richard John, junto com o professor Robert Turrell, eles publicaram uma série de artigos no Washington Post, antecedendo as eleições, fazendo comentários, né, sobre a questão da política das comunicações e como que o Trump ele colocava em risco todo um arranjo geopolítico, interno, institucional, né, como que ele colocava essas coisas em risco. Então, a minha fala ela vai um pouco nesse sentido dos artigos que o professor John publicou nesse momento, né. Peço a compreensão aí para ler, né, rapidinho. Durante minha estadia em Nova York, lembro-me de ter passado por diversas vezes pelo James A. Furley Building, atual Penn Station, imponente edifício situado entre as ruas 31ª e 33ª, onde funcionara por décadas o sede dos Correios naquela cidade. Em sua fachada, lê-se a seguinte inscrição, em português, né? Nem neve, nem chuva, nem calor, nem escuridão, impeçam esses mensageiros da rápida conclusão de suas rondas designadas. Para mim, estudante brasileira, que então começava a me interessar pela história das comunicações, né, e lia aquilo, o significado daquelas palavras era tão exótico quanto a neve, que nunca havia experimentado. O contato com a obra do professor Richard John, nosso convidado de hoje, bem como o aprofundamento de minhas próprias pesquisas, levaram-me, contudo, a constatar, como já havia feito Tocqueville, né, em 1831, analisando aquela gênese do Partido Democrata com Jackson, né, que sim, são os Correios, os sistemas postais, uma das instituições responsáveis pela consolidação do arranjo federativo, democrático, capitalista norte-americano. A importância das comunicações postais nos Estados Unidos, país de proporções continentais e distribuição populacional desigual, como o Brasil, contrasta com a pouca relevância dada a esse objeto nas humanidades. É como se, para funcionarem, as engrenagens dessa complexa máquina que são os Correios devessem ser obliteradas, num processo que os historiadores Gabriel Hatch e Paul Edwards denominaram agnotologia, que é o estudo, né, dessa ignorância ou dúvida culturalmente induzida sobre determinadas instituições ou mecanismos. Né? Mesmo assim, é possível identificar algumas categorias historiográficas com as quais Richard John dialoga. Nos Estados Unidos, os primeiros trabalhos sobre Correios foram realizados pelos próprios funcionários do serviço postal. Exemplo disso são os Annals of the Post Office Department of the United States from the year 1677 to 1851, de 1832, de autoria do agente postal Edmund F. Brown. Nessa obra, sobressai uma imagem oficiosa e pouco problematizada dos Correios, uma das instituições mais importantes do país, segundo o autor. Após a Primeira Guerra Mundial, os Correios voltaram a ser temas de estudos historiográficos nos Estados Unidos, dessa vez sob a ótica de jovens acadêmicos interessados em compreender o papel dessa instituição na formação do país. O trabalho de maior relevo dessa fase é uma bela tese de doutorado, dela mesma, defendida no Departamento de História de Economia da Universidade de Harvard em 1917, intitulada The History of the United States Post Office to the Year 1829, a obra póstuma de Wesley Everett Rich, ele faleceu muito novo, vítima da gripe espanhola, né? Essa obra póstuma, ela analisa as transformações pelas quais os Correios passaram os 40 anos que sucederam à adoção do arranjo federativo constitucional no país. Nas palavras do autor, essa importante atividade do governo, dos Correios, né, é mais do que um dispositivo fiscal, ou mesmo um vasto empreendimento industrial, é uma força social de grande magnitude. Os estudos sobre instituições governamentais sofreram um significativo arrefecimento no pós-Segunda Guerra, né, com o predomínio das narrativas buscando mais os aspectos sociais, de longa duração. Eles foram retomados apenas a partir de 1970, em obras como American Mail, do historiador Wayne Fuller, Urban Growth and the Circulation of Information, do geógrafo Alan Pratt, esse é conhecido aqui do público brasileiro, né, e The Federal Machine, Beginnings of Bureaucracy in Jackson America, do cientista político Matthew Cranston. Para esses autores, as mudanças na administração postal eram um reflexo de transformações mais amplas, como a burocratização da sociedade, o crescimento urbano e o colapso de estruturas socioeconômicas tradicionais. Em contraste com essas interpretações, né, que buscam os fenômenos da comunicação em estruturas ou em explicações mais amplas, os atuais estudos historiográficos que privilegiam a abordagem contextualista, né, e essa abordagem do nosso convidado, têm evidenciado a importância de instituições governamentais, como os Correios. Esses estudos também buscam contextualizar a história das comunicações do país com base em questões tais como: o que significa a organização de uma máquina como os Correios na construção do aparelho administrativo de um Estado federal? Quais as consequências disso para o Estado norte-americano? Como os Correios influíram na gestão cotidiana dos negócios nacionais? O livro Spreading the News, de Richard John, é uma tentativa bem-sucedida de responder a alguns desses questionamentos. Nele, o autor analisa a trajetória regulamentar dos Correios de maneira a refletir sobre o papel dessa instituição na vida política pública norte-americana do século XIX. Inclusive, ele traz essa questão que ele colocou na fala de regionalização. É muito interessante um dos capítulos, quando ele narra o esforço de um dos Postmaster Generals, que foi o Amos Kendall, né, que era braço direito do Jackson, em barrar os periódicos os periódicos abolicionistas que vinham de Nova York, de Boston, para o sul, né, porque os fazendeiros sulistas, eles não queriam que os escravos deles, ou que aquela franja da população né, de baixa renda tivesse contato com esses periódicos incendiários, a gente falaria aqui no Brasil, né, na época do século XIX, o termo incendiário. Então, essa regionalização política é muito perceptível na engrenagem dos Correios. De acordo com o professor John, dado o seu tamanho, escala e complexidade administrativa, é altamente improvável, né, que os Correios sejam apenas um espelho para mudanças originárias em outro domínio. Não menos do que o sistema rodoviário ou as construções com corporações industriais, o sistema postal foi propriamente um agente de mudança. Essa fala ela vem muito contextualizada no sentido da historiografia americana, que prioriza o Congresso como um agente histórico primordial, o Congresso americano como um agente histórico que bind the nation, né? E não o governo federal, na narrativa historiográfica tradicional, ele teria um papel débil nessa formação dos Estados Unidos. E essa perspectiva né, do novo institucionalismo e da contextualismo, ele vem trazer, sim, os Correios, eles são agentes de mudança, as instituições governamentais, elas são agentes de mudança e de coesão territorial dentro dos Estados Unidos. Essa perspectiva que permite a John perceber o perigo inerente às bravatas dirigidas contra os Correios e contra tudo, né, como ele colocou na fala dele, contra as instituições liberais, né, liberais cosmopolitas, do atual presidente dos Estados Unidos. Cito, entre aspas, ao atacar uma das mais amadas e admiradas instituições nacionais, os Correios, Trump está colocando o sistema circulatório do corpo político em um estrangulamento potencialmente letal, que poderia ameaçar nosso futuro por muito tempo depois das eleições. E isso fica bem claro na fala do professor, não só as instituições do Correio, mas, como eu disse, as instituições como um todo sofreram esse estrangulamento durante a gestão Trump, que podem ter consequências, como ele mesmo disse, né? Nós, historiadores, a gente não prevê o futuro, mas elas podem ter consequências desastrosas, né? E ameaçar o futuro, mesmo depois das eleições. O olhar da business history, herdado aí de Alfred Chandler Jr., né? Seu orientador em Harvard, habilitou John, ademais, a quebrar alguns mitos produzidos pelo discurso neoliberal. Eu acho isso interessante. Uma premissa de que a USPS deveria ser privatizada por ser uma empresa deficitária, enfim, é o típico discurso que também a gente ouve aqui em relação às nossas empresas nacionais. Né? Cito, quando argumentos semelhantes surgiram no passado, diz o autor, eles invariavelmente falharam por um motivo simples. O serviço postal público oferece recursos que nenhuma outra transportadora pode oferecer. É isso aqui que também a gente busca, né? Tá chamando a atenção para o debate acadêmico. O serviço público, ele presta um serviço que nenhuma outra empresa privada prestaria, né? Esse seria o real motivo pelo qual gigantes do e-commerce, como, por exemplo, a Amazon, estariam entre os defensores dessa estatal. O raio de abrangência do serviço postal público contempla uma infinidade de localidades que nenhuma operadora privada poderia servir lucrativamente. Gostaria de finalizar meu comentário com algumas reflexões sobre a relevância dessa abordagem para o brasileiro, especialmente para aqueles que trabalham com o fenômeno das comunicações em aspectos históricos, geográficos, sociais. Nós temos aqui, né, no público aí, geógrafos, cientistas sociais, enfim, nós, historiadores. A ausência de dispositivos como voto postal em nosso sistema representativo não significa que os Correios sejam ou tenham sido menos ativos na vida política e econômica do Brasil. Né? De acordo com o relatório da empresa de Correios e Telégrafos para o ano de 2019, 44% do mercado de encomendas é dominado por essa estatal, o que representa uma receita bruta de cerca de 9 bilhões de reais, né? O que dá mais ou menos 1 bilhão e 600 dólares. A companhia detém, ademais, o monopólio do envio de cartas, telegramas e malotes, serviço responsável por 39% das receitas auferidas nesse período. Durante o século XIX, contexto de minha especialidade, os serviços postais brasileiros passaram por significativas transformações. Inicialmente considerados apenas como fonte de renda e vetor de governança, eles tiveram suas funções ampliadas sobre a égide do Estado Nacional. Assim, um decreto emitido em junho de 1831 franqueou de porte todas as folhas periódicas impressas no país. Interessante notar isso, porque nem os Estados Unidos tinha feito tal política tão radical em relação aos periódicos. Os periódicos tinham uma taxa mínima, o professor depois me corrija, de 1 cento, mas existia uma taxa que não, os nossos né, os nossos aí publicistas e políticos do período regencial, eles propuseram abolir essas taxas. Né? Em 1842, foi a vez das cartas terem suas tarifas uniformizadas de acordo com o peso, não mais com a distância percorrida pelos entregadores. Isso foi uma tremenda inovação na época. Né? Nesse mesmo ano, adotou-se o sistema de pagamento antecipado e o uso de selos, tal como havia sido feito 2 anos antes na Inglaterra. A expansão das linhas e o aumento dos fluxos levaram, por fim, à modernização burocrática dos Correios brasileiros, processo cumulativo que se aprimorou nas legislações, né, ao longo das legislações de 1844, 1865, 88, 1890. Vista sob a ótica da historiografia tradicional, que considera apenas as inovações tecnológicas dignas de observação, essas medidas que eu citei, né, por exemplo, do século XIX, tem várias outras do XX, nada tiveram de revolucionárias. Basta notarmos que diversas linhas postais continuaram a ser percorridas a pé ou em lombo de animais, até pelo menos meados do século XX. Meu avô, que foi, né, do serviço postal regional aqui em Campanha, conta dessas entregas em lombo de cavalo, em lombo de burro, a pé, muitas vezes, então esse arcaísmo, né? O telégrafo também não foi, entre nós, uma tecnologia de fácil radicação, a despeito dos esforços de personagens como Cândido da Silva Rondon nesse sentido. Sendo assim, estaríamos inclinados a reconhecer no Brasil a inexistência de uma revolução comunicacional, tal como concebeu Robert Albion, historiador norte-americano pioneiro na utilização desse conceito. Eu tomei conhecimento pela primeira vez desse conceito, revolução comunicacional, ou Communication Revolution, né, com a obra do professor John, e me causava um pouco de desconforto pensar que, pô, no Brasil você não tem essa revolução tecnológica, né, os meios de transporte, de logística, as infraestruturas são muito defasadas, né? Até a Iris mesmo um dia comentou que a própria tecnologia que o Rondon instaurou aqui no Brasil de telégrafos já não era uma tecnologia defasada para a época, né? Então eu ficava muito triste de ver a inexistência desse conceito no Brasil. Porém, né, contudo, se considerarmos mudanças regulamentares, burocratização das repartições, introdução de tarifas especiais, construção de estrada de rodagem, diversificação de ofertas de serviço, etc., né? Esses aspectos institucionais e infraestruturais como critérios de inovação, né? Esse conceito de inovação, né, que vem lá da historiografia econômica e aprimorada aí pelo business history, e é isso que propõe o Richard John, né? O conceito acima mencionado de revolução nas comunicações não fica tão distante da nossa realidade, afinal de contas, nós fomos, inclusive, pioneiros ou avangardistas em muitas das implementações comunicacionais, né? Afinal de contas, né, esse conceito de inovação aí também é fundamental, tanto no trabalho do professor Richard, ele retoma isso do Schumpeter, né, quanto no meu trabalho eu tento também explorar. Afinal de contas, tanto no Brasil como nos Estados Unidos, os Correios foram e ainda são infraestrutura basilar de adensamento do Estado e do território, de adensamento do Estado e do mercado no território, né? Assim que um trabalho aparentemente circunscrito à história norte-americana, também uma fala, né, que nos brindou aqui sobre a política norte-americana, regional, na atualidade, ganha pela primeira vez espaço de discussão entre o público brasileiro, né? Não é uma fala totalmente circunscrita aos Estados Unidos. Os pontos de interseção entre Brasil e Estados Unidos, e aí eu pontuo, né, não só a questão das comunicações, como essa própria, e aí abro, né, aí eu deixo para o debate, essa questão da regionalização da política. No Brasil talvez nós vemos um fenômeno semelhante ou inverso, não sei, queria partilhar com os colegas a impressão, né? Vários pontos de interseção no que diz respeito à economia política das comunicações, né? E aí eu estou chamando a economia política das comunicações algo mais amplo, a gestão, né, não só dos sistemas de comunicação, mas como ele colocou na fala, do fluxo de pessoas, de mercadorias, dessas fronteiras internas e externas, dessa social insecurity, né, que ele colocou, fazendo de certa forma, até uma brincadeira aí com o termo social security, que é, de certa forma, o único sistema de previdência que você tem nos Estados Unidos, né, o número do social security, para muita gente, significa vida. né? Até eu me lembro de um texto que a gente leu só fazendo uma divagação para o final, né? De um texto que a gente leu na disciplina dele, lá em Colômbia. As pessoas no início do século XX, elas costumavam tatuar o número do Social Security nos braços, para eles nunca perderem aquele número, porque aquele número, para muitos afro-americanos, significava a vida, significava a única garantia que eles tinham de ter alguma renda, de ter alguma ajuda do Estado. Né? E aí ele brinca com as palavras aí, falando Social Security. Né? Bom, fica a dica, né? Todos esses pontos de contato aí entre as nossas agendas, né? Fica a dica para construirmos agendas de pesquisa conjuntas, né? Tanto nessa economia política das comunicações, quanto nas instituições políticas de representatividade e de governamentabilidade, né? Muito obrigada, espero que eu tenha feito aí uma ponte entre o público e entre o professor John, e abro para os debates, abro para as perguntas. Podem, né, como eu estou de mediadora, quem quiser fazer a pergunta em português me passa, que eu, né, traduzo. Quem já quiser fazer diretamente em inglês, fique à vontade. Professor John, we are going now open to questions and small debate. I hope to do satisfactorily build between your talk and our concerns as infrastructure history group. I hope to build this link with you and us, okay? And then questions.
We have one, Ricardo. I don't know.
Ricardo, gosh. Oh, it's my colleague from Alexandre Sais. We have the same advisor.
Pérola or is translate the cache?
Yes, I can translate the next Pérola can.
Okay, let me see here. Okay.
Ricardo is asking Professor John if it is possible a comparison between the construction of the post-mail system in the making of the unity of North America and the actual role of the digital networks in the corrosion, at the disruption of disruption of this national unity. If you can make a comparison between these two networks, yes, the post office and the digital networks.
Thank you. An excellent question. The postal network in the United States expanded just after the adoption of the Constitution, beginning in 1792, and by 1828 had linked together every city, town, hamlet of any size in the country. And the creation of this network was very important for a nationwide market. It was important for voluntary associations that would use the mail. It was also important for the political parties. So the political party, the Democratic Party that I mentioned in my talk, the party of Andrew Jackson, they built on the postal network in two ways. First, they used the postal network to circulate information. And second, they dismissed a lot of the postal staff in order to put their own people in. And by putting their own people in, that created the material foundation for the Democratic Party. And when the opponents, first the Whigs and then the Republicans, came in power, they did the same thing. So the two political parties in the United States relied on jobs and contracts from the post office. Now you'd say, well, how can that possibly be? Because the post office was about 90% of all federal jobs in the 19th century. So it was a very major material foundation for mass politics. Now, what does this have to do with national identity? Well, before 1828, that is to say, before the election of Jackson, public figures assumed that the postal network, by facilitating the circulation of newspapers and other publications with information on public affairs, including pamphlets and government documents, would help to knit together, to unite a very disparate group of Americans who were in regional blocks. The consequence was that you had a kind of entente. The party helped to bridge those regional divides using the post office as their means. Now, there was a major exception, and that was the debate over slavery. The Southerners, I believe Pérola may have spoken about this a little bit, the Southerners blocked the circulation of information on the slavery issue. So you can argue, and I have argued, that beginning in 1835, an institution, the post office, that had helped to unite the country, maybe superficially, but it had helped to bring people together, now was dividing them apart. Now, the most recent historians who've been looking at this period with an eye to national identity have contended that as American politics became increasingly connected with religious issues, that it became increasingly divided. If you are familiar with Benedict Anderson's imagined community, he makes the argument that national identity, and indeed the First Nations, were the nations of the Americas, not Europe. That was an elite-driven project, which was in keeping with what the founders did between the 1790s and the 1820s. But there's a shift in the 1830s with an injection of highly charged religious issues into national politics. And that makes it hard to sustain the unity that you had before the 1820s and contributed to the American Civil War. So with the slavery question settled in 1865, the two parties are able to use the means of communication to perpetuate their regional alliances, cross-regional coalitions, really. And that held in place until the 1960s, when the Democratic Party rejected its Southern white supremacist, well, let's call them segregationist, anti-civil rights bloc. Some say a whole country's white supremacist. Anyway, rejecting that bloc in the South. And that was done in a very public way through the media. For example, there was a famous Supreme Court case called Sullivan v. New York Times, which gave Northern editors the right to report on the South, even if their report was displeasing to Southerners. Before Sullivan v. New York Times, it was very hard for Northern journalists to report on the South. That is to say, race relations. Now, internet, and I'll stop. The internet is very new. It only went public in 1995, and Facebook, I had the co-founder of Facebook in my class last year, Chris Hughes. I mean, they're much younger than I am. Those networks are driven by a different set of incentives than newspapers or wire service, the Associated Press. They're driven by what we call an attention economy, to try to keep people engaged. No longer are we concerned about a scarcity of opportunities to publish. Nowadays, anyone can publish. You just set up a Twitter feed. The challenge today is who's paying attention, who's reading your Twitter feed. So the scarcity is in attention, not in production. And that has disrupted the news media ecology, which until the 1990s, arguably until the 2000 teens, still had a strong regional component. There were big city newspapers that were influential. Everyone paid attention to the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times and the Chicago Tribune. That's no longer the case. So the digital media has created a new kind of layer where it's possible to reach your supporters and only your supporters. And so you have what we call media bubbles. You have very different feeds. I'm sure you have the same in Brazil. And that has transformed national politics so that the regional basis of politics that really held up until 20th century has now been, 21st century, has now been largely undermined. So the media once drove, the networks once helped to unite the country. They did it with a lot of regulation, which we could talk about because it's not often talked about in American public policy circles. It was not an unfettered media. Just think of the way the Southerners blocked circulation of information on slavery, or the way the television networks were regulated in the 1950s and 60s to prevent a heterodox religious voices. A student of mine just finished a dissertation on this topic, showing how religious groups that were proselytizing, that were not ecumenical, were prevented from airwaves. And this could change in the United States now with new Supreme Court composition, but it's also changing with the internet. You don't need to subject yourself to federal government regulation to reach a large audience. So yes, once the networks united, then they divided, then they united again over remarkable changes in technology, including the coming of radio and television, and movies. Today, they are dividing again. Let me say one more thing. It is impossible today to make a Hollywood movie that has villains who are Chinese. That's because the Chinese government is indirectly censoring American movies because there's a huge Chinese audience. So there still are pressures that are shaping media content in the United States, though they no longer are all under the authority of U.S. government or U.S.-based religious groups. The Catholic Church was quite important in censoring movie content for much of the 20th century, Hollywood movie content. So that's a long answer to a short question. It was a very good question. I'm happy to talk more about communication networks, past and present, if that's what another question. The role of social media and the creation of the internal enemy. So that's a good question. The question, someone want to put it into Portuguese or we just assume? Yeah. Okay. It's very hard to comment on recent events. What is driving what? President Trump was very effective at using an American social media platform called Twitter to speak directly to voters without the mediation of journalists or networks or anybody else, even his own advisors. So that I believe he probably has followers outside the United States. So that is breaking down the control that was exercised not only by national regulators or a national organization like the Catholic Church, but also state level regional bodies. You can go around the elites. You can go over the elites. And his audience then is going to be attracted to posts that are more and more incendiary, more and more critical opposition, because we know the social psychologists tell us that that's how the human psyche works, that you tend to be attracted to keep your attention to something that's new, to something that's extreme, to something that is edgy. One of the great strengths, to be a little more philosophic, of American media in much of the 20th century was that the journalists would limit certain kinds of transgressive expression. And the left in this country for the long time had the belief, which I always thought was mistaken, which now I think is being quite clearly shown to be mistaken, that transgressivity favors the left. Well, it doesn't. Transgressivity, that is to say, the challenge to norms, favors whoever is challenging the norms. It doesn't have a valence, left or right. And the kind of left liberal consensus has been quite important in, let's call it prestige media, television, radio, magazines. And that control now has been severely eroded, in part because we don't have any effective regulation over what is broadcast on radio. Till the mid-1980s, the Reagan administration, it would have been impossible for a conservative talk radio station to flourish because you would have had to broadcast opposing viewpoints. That was called the Fairness Doctrine. With the abolition of that doctrine, it was now possible for niche radio stations to broadcast without inhibition, without any threat to their license. So Rush Limbaugh, who's a popular radio announcer in the United States, emerged directly following that change in public policy. So it would be a mistake to contend that the United States has had an unregulated media ecology. We have not. We've always had a regulated media ecosystem. It's been regulated by the federal government. It's been regulated by state and municipal government. It's been regulated by religious groups. And it's been regulated by journalists who, for much of our history, were beholden to their employers, which were not only the editors, but also the businesses that were advertising in their publications or on their television or radio broadcasts. That is changing. And if the Democratic Party right now is in the position of being the defender of the old order, and the Republicans are defending a new media order, which is not necessarily in alignment with traditional left-right distinctions, right? And there's a recent book by Jen Schrady, which I reviewed, Schradie. I reviewed it. You can look it up. It's on how social media favors conservatives. And that book was a great puzzle to the left when it came out, a lot of my colleagues, because they tweet all the time and they're on the internet and they just thought that the internet was favorable to people like themselves. But it isn't, according to Jen Schrady. That in fact, the groups that are disadvantaged economically, socially, say African American women, those groups are best mobilized in elections through rather traditional means, face-to-face, small group meetings, labor unions, some kind of churches, not by social media. Social media tends to favor relatively more affluent, or certainly relatively more deliberately savvy groups that include a lot of let's say, Trump Republicans. This has not been well understood. There are a lot of misperceptions about who uses social media in the United States and what the consequences of use of social media are in the United States. And by the way, I've just been reading a study by a colleague of mine, Pérola, perhaps you remember her, Emily Z, on Chinese social media. And it seems that the Chinese have moved ahead of the United States in terms of the technical sophistication. But the wrinkle is that the party and the government is much more tightly in control of the content. And that may, that's a puzzle right now. I do not see great hope for a kind of unity coming from social media. It's more likely that the unity will come from political parties or international events. And having said that, reflecting back on the early republic, the newspapers of the early republic were very, very different by region. The Postmaster General Amos Kendall, who I believe Professor Goldberg referred to, he said we are 35 nations with regard to opinion in the 1830s. And that his hope was that the government could set up an express service to circulate editorial opinion by horseback in advance of newspapers. So you would no longer circulate newspapers through the railroad, but you would just circulate the news, price information. So there'd be no public sphere. That was the democratic vision. After the Civil War, we created a public sphere that New York Associated Press helped to control because they, in effect, took over Kendall's vision of supplying news and not opinion. And that group then was able to get into the South in the 60s. Now, the New York Associated Press a couple of weeks ago called the election. In previous years, we would assume that that was the end of it. But there's no the New York Associated Press has no, the Associated Press, it's not the New York Associated Press anymore. The Associated Press has no legal or constitutional mandate. It's just a convention that if they call the election, that's the election. We're waiting for the Electoral College to meet. But that suggests some of the ways in which the mainstream media or this kind of centrist, corporate-backed media ecology has come under severe strain. And Biden sees himself as a change agent to help to bring that back. Whether he will succeed or not is an open question. And if he doesn't, then we may well move to more rather than less regulation of media if we're going to preserve some kind of civic identity. And the last thing I'll say about that is, both in the first half of the 19th century and today, religious and cultural issues are very important in dividing American people, not just economic issues.
Yeah. There is Maíra also asked, does Professor John think that there was any role of the vote by the mail in the result of the U.S. election, or was just an expressive?
I have written a fair amount about the post office in the 2020 election. If anybody cares about that, you can find the links at my website, all in English.
Yeah, I chat in the link.
So I've written a fair amount about that, or just little pieces. But here's what we know. The basis of the process. New Postmaster General was appointed by Trump, and there are reasons that he was an unusual appointment. He was not appointed in the regular chain of decision making. And David Williams, who was the former Inspector General of the Post Office, resigned in opposition to his appointment. Lydia DeJoy, he comes out of a logistics background. And following his appointment, changes were made in the postal administration that decreased the effectiveness of the post office in distributing ballots. Mail-in ballots are very important this year because we're in a pandemic, as you know, and large numbers of voters did not want to go to the polls directly. Now, the political issue here, and you can see why it's a political issue, Republicans feared that if you indiscriminately mail ballots to everyone, nothing to do with fraud, but if you just mail everyone who's an eligible citizen a ballot, that a disproportionate number of the voters who are going to return those ballots are going to be Democrats. That's an assumption that the Republican Party strategists held. And Trump has reinforced this assumption, saying that if everybody votes, the Republicans will never win another election in the country, which is one of the many outrageous things he said. Public figures don't customarily say, if people vote, I'll lose. But that's what Trump said. So now, a lot of mail-in ballots came in. States like Oregon had been voting mail-in ballot for decades, right? But mail-in ballots were increased. Who would they favor? The assumption was that the mail-in ballots would heavily favor Democrats. Why? Because Democrats are disproportionately congregated in big cities, and this may be bizarre for Brazilians to understand, but the wearing of masks and the response to the pandemic has become a political issue. So Republicans are less likely to wear a mask and to take seriously the pandemic. So Democrats are more likely to take it seriously, and as a consequence, more likely to vote by mail. Now, what were the results? Yes, in Pennsylvania, the mail-in ballots heavily favored, as expected, Democrats. Trump then contends, well, that's fraud. But he's really trying to invalidate the ballots of people who didn't vote for him. The state-level election officials working with the post office have determined that very little electoral fraud. Now, there has been a lot of electoral fraud in the United States in the past, as in many countries. But this election was highly watched, and there are no credible court challenges that Trump has made about these late ballots, mostly mail-in ballots. That's what he's focusing on as of now. And there's been an awful lot of money and an awful lot of effort put into delegitimating the election by contending that the mail-in ballots were phony ballots. And the reason I hesitate about the Electoral College is his strategy now seems to be to convince electors not to vote as their state dictates them to vote. They should vote. I doubt that will happen, but don't know. A lot of things have happened that I didn't expect. So we'll know about that in 2 weeks. So yes, mail-in ballots. Mail-in ballots are likely to become more common. I suspect the Republicans will figure out that if they get mail-in ballots to their supporters, that they're going to become more enthusiastic about mail-in ballots. But this time around, Trump hyped the concern that large number of Democrats are voting illegally. And this is an issue that goes back to 2016. It really goes back to the relaxation of the restrictions on Southern election management that come out of the civil rights movement. Until the 1960s, African Americans were blocked from voting in much of the South. That was illegal, but it happened. And what the Democrats are contending is that those old procedures are being revived today. I think the Republicans will be smart enough to recognize that there are enough voters, poor and voters who do not ordinarily come to the polls, doesn't matter whether they're poor or rich, for them to lobby them, and that the disapproval of mail-in balloting may decline. Because the states that have used it, like Oregon, find it to be very effective. So that's a long answer about a short question. I'm happy to talk more about mail-in ballots or about election. Yeah.
I will profit this question to ask you, here in Brazil, we don't have postal vote. It's not an institution from our representative system, but we have something that in United States you don't use, that is the electronic vote. So you can, votes here are not from paper. You can write your vote and put in a urna, como que por aí. You can put your vote in it's not concrete, like it's electronic. What do you think about this? I think it maybe United States, why United States didn't use this kind of technology or this kind of infrastructure to the representative?
We have, of course, voting machines that are electronic at polling places. That's different. And there's been a lot of concern in the past about ballot stuffing, that is to say, putting ballots that are not legitimate into polling places. There's been a lot of concern about foreign governments interfering with voting machines. There's been concern about voting machines, particularly in Ohio, in I think it was, 2004, 2008. Those voting machines being manufactured by a company that was supportive of one of the candidates. It was George W. Bush. So there's suspicion of voting. And that suspicion of vote rigging can be found in both parties. So that's the context for what I would think would be pretty general opposition to permitting voting from your home by an electronic terminal. One criticism would be, well, not everybody has access to electronic terminals. Well, what if you then set one up in the local post office? Well, okay, but the post office is limited in what it can do. Well, then how do you know that that vote is a legitimate vote? And we require the voters to sign. You sign your name, and that is checked. And when I voted early, but I voted in person. I did not trust the mail-in ballots. I was worried that my mail-in ballot was not going to get to the polling place on time, because the new Postmaster General, DeJoy, instituted some reforms that were slowing the processing of mail. So I voted in person. My signature was matched, and I voted. And both of the parties, the parties are not in control of the election, but they tend to have a lot of influence over how the election is conducted, because that's a matter decided on by the individual states. So in different states, you can have different rules, and you do. And there will probably be enough lawmakers in the states to oppose both mandatory voting, which you have in Australia, or electronic voting from home. And a couple of arguments would be used. One, fraud. Second, there was this longstanding argument that it's a sort of civic ritual that people vote. Not so much this year, because a lot of people voted.
Here, just one day. We do this here in just one day, like one day.
Okay, yeah. Well, we've got away from that now. We now are voting over a period of several weeks before the election day, and that is likely to continue. Election day is not a holiday, so some people cannot get off from work to vote. And both parties in different places support making it relatively hard for the opponent's voters to come to the polls. Strange as that would sound, but that's a long-standing political practice. So I do not think we're going to shift to electronic voting from home. In fact, I've not heard any proposal to that effect, which is a really interesting comparative observation. Why not? Those would be some of the reasons. I can't hear you.
Pérola.
Yeah, this question, the trends of the elections of 2016, I think you have already talked about that. They point to a change in the relations between state and nation. This idea, nation, like as you work with this concept, or Benedict Anderson worked with this concept.
Yes. one of the great surprises for Americanists about Benedict Anderson's imagined community is that Latin America and the United States is so important, and that nation is new, and the nation is a deliberate contrivance in North America, and I believe in South America. It was a sort of neo-colonial elite that was taking charge, not democratizing, but an elite that was not necessarily rallying around language or even identity, but just around a class position in opposition to an imperial elite. And if we take that, as I think we can, then we begin to see how limited national identity was at the start. It was different from the Levée en masse in France. It was an elite project of bringing together, let's say, colonial leaders in different port cities. That shifts by the mid-19th century, and we have a more broader conception of nation, much more infused with religiosity. And that would continue. The phrase in our Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, United States and America, for one nation, under God, indivisible. The phrase under God was not added to the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance until the 1950s. It was not there in the beginning. So, which is not to say the United States is not a religious country, but the relationship between religiosity and nationhood at the national level has shifted. Today, we are seeing, we now have 6 Catholics on the Supreme Court, 3 Jews, no Protestants. It's no mystery that in many Catholic countries, there's a different set of understandings about the relationship of church and state than in Protestant countries. So it's possible there will be a religiously inflected shift there. But, what's so bizarre about this, I think from an international point of view, is that the United States is a major player globally. So these internal issues operate in a completely different scale. I don't make predictions, but I will say that the increased assumption that the Republican Party has a religious, really pan-Catholic Protestant identity, that is not entirely unprecedented. There were claims in the 19th century that was true of the Republican Party, but it's being aggressively asserted in a way that is different. And therefore, the nation state, there's been a liberal internationalist assumption that the federal government is no established church, and the federal government is sort of neutral. Now, there was a ruling that came down today by the Supreme Court where Amy Barrett is now on. There's a solid Catholic majority, and there is concern on her part and of the other conservatives that federal social policy interferes with religious prerogatives, healthcare, or in this instance, whether the New York governor can ban the meeting of, say, large numbers of Jews or large numbers of, doesn't matter what religious group. Hasidic Jews is a specific issue. And
the Catholics there are progressive Catholics or from institutions like Opus Dei and conservative?
Religious. Well, there's lots of Catholics. Say large numbers of Jews, large numbers of a whole series of rulings as Hasidic Jews, and the Catholic Church.
But the Catholics there are progressive Catholics or from institutions like Opus
doesn't have to provide birth control.
Well, there's lots of laws say large numbers of large numbers that the city
the Catholics there are
religious predispositions are in conflict with government policy. And I predict, and that's going to shift the relationship of the state and nationhood in the years to come. It's a surprise in many parts of the world, but there is a lively debate over abortion in the United States. And it would not be at all surprising if the Supreme Court ended the legal protection for abortion that has been in place since Roe v. Wade. School prayer, whole host of issues, taxation, where the court is now. Most of the court's rulings deal with public policy, business and public policy. These are public policy issues. I misspoke. But so there, the court tends to favor corporations against states and localities. In the case of religion, the Supreme Court may rule the other way. And it made such ruling in a recent case involving a business, Hobby Lobby, that did not wish to provide benefits to its employees that included provisions that the president of the company regarded as religiously, and he objected to on religious grounds. So how the social media will reinforce or not reinforce that is hard to say. And quite frankly, if you have a more open debate on abortion in the United States, it's very hard to know how that would turn out. The trend globally has been the other direction, but the United States is peculiar in many ways. There's a great deal of popular religiosity in the United States, much more than in, say, in Britain or France or Germany. I don't know how it would compare with Brazil. So I don't know if I answered the question about state and nation.
Yeah. This book, Benedict Anderson's book, Imagined Communities, are very well read here in Brazil, and our students and our public are very familiarized with this, especially because he points the question of Latin America as a new experiment, as you put it. And I think this question, this religious issue that we now have in the United States with Catholics, Jews, and we are facing here in Brazil with the Neo-Pentecostal wave, which is different from Neo-Pentecostal wave in the United States. Here is from poor people who doesn't have access to other other social help from the state. They go to churches, Neo-Pentecostal churches, in order to have some help from these leaders. And this, especially one of the churches, the Igreja Universal do Reino de Deus, Universal Church from the King of God, they are doing like a kind of imperialistic agenda with churches in Africa, with Portuguese speaking. They are really building empire. This sect, this church here in Brazil. I think our challenge now is to try to put religion in their box, like the religion take part of the politics. Was always like that. There are two realms that we can separate, but we can neutralize the religious discourse. At least in Brazil, it's urgent that.
So response to that is, in the United States, in the early republic, Protestant groups, not Pentecostal, but Protestant groups were very active in creating an evangelical empire. Missionaries, abolitionists, anti-slavery, temperance, women's rights, all these movements. In fact, the whole idea, the modern idea of rights in the United States comes out of this evangelical moment. So putting religious groups in a box is an interesting phrase. And I don't think I think that's what the religious groups feel has happened. But if you look at American civic culture, religion has been a very positive influence for a very long time. Not only in terms of creating identity for immigrant groups and social policy issues, but it has been it's helped to sustain an identity that has reinforced and it's somehow complemented national identity, which is secular under the First Amendment. States, Utah to this day has a strong religious character because of the Mormon Church. And a whole bunch of Supreme Court rulings since the Civil War tried to push back on the ability of states to defend distinctive religious practices. So there are many Democrats who would take that view, put religion in the box, religion's dangerous, religion needs to be in its place. Certainly with regard to Catholicism, that was a common view in the 19th century by the elite. But if you take a more radical view of American history, and I'm here very much influenced by a recent book by a very gifted cultural historian named Eugene McCarrer, McCarraher, called The Enchantments of Mammon. He makes the argument that, in fact, the United States has been a religious nation for a long time, and the religion has been capitalism. And he is a devout Episcopalian, he's Protestant, he comes out of a Catholic background, but he's very interested, say, in environmental, ecological movements that have a religious cast. And so the argument isn't that the United States is secular. The argument is the United States has been misenchanted by a kind of a commercial ethos. And it's a very interesting argument. It's a very well-made argument. It's a long, brilliant, beautifully written book. And so that, I think, going forward, if you think about the ecological challenges or public health challenges or these very difficult questions of identity and meaning, to put religion in its box in the United States, if you said that, then you are basically saying that the civil rights movement should not have occurred. The civil rights movement was a religious movement coming out of the African American church. That the opposition to the First World War was a religious movement. In fact, David Hollinger, Hollinger, one of our greatest intellectual historians, has recently published a book called After Cloven Tongues of Fire. Cloven tongues of fire, that's the Pentecostal phrase from the book of Acts. And he makes the argument that the liberal Protestants, that would be a group that I'm a member of, actually created much of what is admirable about post-Second World War United States, but now they're out. But that's not necessarily an argument to put religion in its box. That's an argument to find ways to revive and strengthen religious groupings. In other words,
I think I didn't express myself well, like putting when you said like religion, the role of religion in politics, after I thought, oh my God, like the ideology of liberation here in Brazil, Ideologia da Libertação, which is a leftist movement, it was raised in the Catholic progressive middle. Like, so we can, it's not a case of to put the religion in the box, but to try to neutralize how can I say, the discourse against the other, because here the problem is that neo-Pentecostals, they have the discourse against the other. It's like in the United States, you have the inner enemy. Like the inner enemy is my cousin or my aunt or my uncle leftist in the Thanksgiving table. Here we have the same, with this discourse that the range against the other, and this is very we pass the same phenomena here. It's not the Thanksgiving. We are in a Zoom. We are in a table dining with a family Thanksgiving, but it's like in Christmas. This Christmas is going to be a war between families. We are facing that here, and just to finish, because the talk is very exciting, but we have to finish. I think our friend Amanda Caporrino, she has a question that I think I can answer with you. In Brazil, the post office assumed had a very how can I say, wide scope of functions. Like we have banks in post office, we have transportation of pedagogic books, etc. And United States, you have the same. Like since at least the second half of the 19th century, we have banking, postal banking. Actually, I think it was a French invention, isn't it? The postal banking.
I would like also to join the links between the railroads and the networks of the maritime networks, and if you can join the problem of the submarine cables and
sure. Sure. So postal banking. You had postal banking in France, in Britain, in Japan. It was adopted in the United States, I think, in 1910 under the Taft administration. Mercer Baradaran is today proposing we bring back postal banking. Elizabeth Warren, Senator Baradaran's a law professor. Elizabeth Warren is a senator from Massachusetts. I've supported bringing back postal banking in public writing. There's a large percentage of Americans who are unbanked, maybe depending upon who you count, 6% to 20%. The interest rates are high. It seems to me if you're going to have a commercial economy, if everyone's going to be of opportunity to participate, everyone should have access to credit. So postal banking is a means to that end. Now, other networks, just to give an overview, this is a book that I'm going to be, after I finish the book I'm working on now, I'm going to turn to this book, Putting United States Communication Networks in a Global Perspective. And I just recently published an essay. I think, Pérola, you have an essay in the same collection, an Italian group on this. Right? You have an essay in there. Yeah, on Brazil.
Yeah, I was there.
I just got the book. Yeah, but I just got the book, so I saw everybody's in it.
Yeah, you got it. I didn't. I didn't yet.
I just got the book.
It's in the mail.
Yeah. So I argued in that essay that United States communication networks were configured to promote expansion on the continent, but not to compete with the British in the Atlantic market. And that was true for the cable. The Atlantic cable is a British project. We talk about Cyrus Field, but Field isn't really that important. The engineering talent, the finance, the government support, all the end comes from Britain. And that was a logical successor to the British support for the Cunard steamships, which were a major communication channel in the 19th century. It was a dual use project that in the Crimean War, the steamships could be transferred to the Mediterranean as ship troop transports. And they were, some of them were. So we have a 19th century infrastructure where the United States is very much taking advantage of Britain. And there's a small effort to steamboats to Brazil and Latin America and across the railroad at Panama, but it's overwhelmingly oriented. Now, late in the century, you get a movement for parcel post in Europe, bigger than 1 pound. And some of the reformers in the United States who wanted to expand the postal network for ordinary people to communicate were opposed to parcels because they made a sharp distinction between information and goods. So we don't get parcel post until the Wilson administration, 1913. And the primary reason we didn't get it until so late, this is the theme I'm making, how the United States was late, how we didn't do things that they did in other parts of the world, was because you had a lot of wholesalers and small town merchants that did not want big city merchants to be flooding their locality with low-cost goods, which is what happened after the First World War. Remember, the United States was a high tariff country, very high tariffs. And that was a pillar of the Republican Party. So the high tariffs blocked foreign goods, and parcel post helped to keep the localities from being swamped by the distant cities. So the United States did not reconfigure its communication networks in a major way until after the Second World War. But a very interesting moment, and I published on this, occurred in the 1920s when the reformers under Wilson administration, who wanted the government to take over radio, all radio was at this time was a bundle of patents that the Navy took from the British and the Germans. So radio is patents. There is no radio broadcasting until 1920. Radio broadcasting emerges in an anti-monopoly context without direct government supervision. But then the question comes, well, should the government take it over? The corporations fight back. And they invent basically the American system of broadcasting, which is advertising driven, public poll dependent, because you need to know who your listeners are to figure out how much you should charge for advertising. And they blocked direct government intervention. The next moment came after the Second World War, when the federal government massively invests in Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, the CIA gets involved, and the United States then has a very robust international presence. In Latin America, they were challenging, as Heidi Tworek's recent book has shown, they were challenging the Germans, who had a big investment in broadcast, at least certainly in Argentina, maybe in Brazil too. I don't know. You'd have to ask Heidi Tworek. But we got into that market after the Second World War. And now with Trump, we're pulling isolationism, we're pulling back from those international commitments. So that's and of course with the internet, all came out of the government. It had nothing to do with a corporation. And then the corporations took it over. A lot of the Apple investment comes from government. You wouldn't have an iPhone without government funding. And then they took it over, and then they promoted this rhetoric of inclusivity and network externality and promise and all these things, which is just an effort to kind of cream skim on the infrastructure that they didn't build. And so now we're in a position where there are challenges coming to, the most immediate challenges are coming to Amazon, which is a big American distributor of all kinds of goods and services, including food. those challenges now are being waged on the terrain of anti-monopoly. And that's one reason I'm writing about anti-monopoly now, to try to understand the nature of these challenges. But the anti-monopoly argument has to be completely reframed, and that's what one of my Columbia colleagues, Lena Kahn, has done, because the anti-monopoly argument was refashioned in the 20th century to be very pro-corporate, pro-big business. So that's where the challenge is today. It may be that the more effective challenge is going to come from China, companies like TikTok, with the Chinese government backing. But that's an issue for the future, and that's something the Biden administration is going to have to engage. There was very little discussion in the 2020 election about Russian interference. There was a great deal of discussion in the 2016 election about Russian interference. And whether or not the United States government has gained control of its own borders with regard to information is an open question. But certainly it was not as much discussed in 2020 as it was in 2016. Now, whether that simply means that the Trump administration was more effective at preventing there from being a discussion, or whether there was actually less interference, or whether the Democrats exaggerated the Russian interference to create a foreign enemy, are all good questions. But that's another area in which it's going to be thrust onto the international arena, where the United States is not going to be in as dominant a position as it was in, say, after the Second World War, when Washington was able to establish the liberal internationalism whose decline I've been talking about.
Excellent close. I think it's a good question, this enemy Democrats has created or not. And with these words, we can finish our live with I'm very pleased to have you here today, Professor. It was a nice chat, a nice live. We have a lot of public here, questions, and I'm very excited with this. I hope this is the first of many invitations that we post to you to have more contact with us in Brazil. And certainly we will invite Emily to talk about China. I get excited with this perspective. That will be great. Maybe we can have a chat together. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Kantor, and thank you, Professor Nunes.
Meninas, vocês querem, finalizar em português?
Have a good weekend, and have a good weekend.
Thank you.
I hope you don't have political discussions going on.
Well, not in my immediate family, but when we Zoomed yesterday with my sister in Michigan, we had to be very careful.
Yes, and we have to be very open to assimilate and to try to put in context every assumption. So thank you so much. This was a great meeting. I would like to thank everybody who was with us this Friday, and thank you, Josiane, again for your commitment. Thank you to Fábio, who was in the backstage of the University of São Paulo, Faculdade de Filosofia. And we are going now to put the legends to translate your talk, and this will be available to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So much. Thank you, Iris. Thank you, Professor Richard. Pérola. It's an excellent explanation. Thank you so much.
With a special thanks to Diana Roberts. Yeah, I emailed her asking if she has an image that epitomized your talk, like what do you think about post offices and post communications, and she sent me a beautiful photograph from her collection with the mail and the railroad, and it was our link topic. And then I don't know if they were online, but they were always good friends that we miss with us.
Mm-hmm. Yes, my daughter will be visiting Robert and Diane next week.
Oh, really? Oh, how about Anne-Marie? She's happy with
She had a wonderful first semester at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, even though, of course, many of her courses were online, but she was on campus.
Oh, yeah. Hope someday, next year, maybe, we can meet again in Prado. Bruno is very excited to this. He's with commitment to make this happen.
That would be
eu também quero agradecer o Carlos Gabriel, o Caio Adam, o Maurício, que estiveram
todo mundo do nosso grupo.
O Tomás Fortunato, quem mais?
Foi muito bom.
A Maíra, né? O Apindaia, que também tem um trabalho sobre Correios, e todos que fizeram questões. A gente tem que encerrar também, tá bom?
We need to finish, but thanks a lot, and that's it. We can chat later. I will email you with some proposals about some next conversations. Okay, we can stay in touch.
Excellent. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.